In the past week, I've been tagged at least 13 times on Facebook in an archery video that's being circulated on the interwebs which makes a lot of claims about modern and historical archery and asked what I make of it. Now, a quick search on the internet will turn up all sorts of archery, bad and good, and generally, the good representations of the fastest growing sport in the US basically outweigh the bad. Enter Lars Andersen. Dubbing himself the fastest archer on the planet, Lars sets about making claims about archery and then demonstrating shooting techniques based on those claims. It's not his techniques which have gotten him in hot water, though, so much as his claims about those techniques. So first off, let's be clear about what he's doing here. Lars is performing what's called trick shooting. Trick shooting isn't a derogatory term. It's not meant to imply that something is faked, although there are aspects to the video that veer into outright misrepresentations, which we'll get into later. Trick shooting is basically stunt shooting. Like everything else, it takes practice, and the methods and stunts vary nearly as widely as the individual practitioners. And with his speed and antics, Lars has the potential to be an entertaining as well as very fast shooter. But Lars isn't claiming to be yet another speed trick shooter. He's making a lot of extraordinary claims about history as well as modern archery. Articles titled, "Everything You Know About Archery is a Lie" and "YouTuber Destroys Every Hollywood Archery Myth" feature Lars's video, which purports to revolutionize archery by rediscovering forgotten techniques that were, according to Lars, universal at one point in antiquity and which work better than any other technique. What he ends up doing is anything but revolutionizing archery. Let's examine the claims he makes one by one. Be warned, there's a lot to unpack here. Number 1. The methods he uses were once widespread but have been long since forgotten until he rediscovered them. The video claims that Lars bases his claims on studying historical pictures of archers and reading historical manuscripts. If this is true, then this was his first mistake. Judging what was historically accurate by what ancient images show isn't actually the best method by which to judge historical accuracy in techniques, let alone their relative quality. There are countless representations of archery today, in photos, in comic books, and in film, which depict what would be incredibly poor skill in real life, even in many cases completely impossible physics-wise for the arrow to get to where the archer wants it to. And it's simply because the artist wasn't familiar with the techniques of archery. Modern artists have an incredible wealth of resources to draw upon to research good archery form, and yet many still manage to mess it up. Artists of the past would have had even fewer resources to draw upon. So basing one's research on representations done by people who had no experience in a discipline and who often weren't even eyewitnesses to the battles they were documenting isn't going to yield accurate results. Also, it's a stretch to claim that you're rediscovering anything forgotten if you're looking at pictures of archery through the ages on the internet. To illustrate his video's points, Lars didn't go spelunking and discover secret pictures hidden away in dusty tombs. The images he's using are easily found online by anyone. Images, we'll see, that literally contradict some of his own points. Also, he refers to a book titled Arab Archery as the most extensive historical book about archery to bolster his claims about speed shooting. The quote he pulled about speed shooting from that book says, "This is the best type of shooting and there is nothing beyond it in power or accuracy, and no one can manage to do it except a person who has trained himself in it and has obtained mastery in it and also in horsemanship." What he doesn't say is that the dialogue taking place in this book is remarkably silent on the actual details of the technique of speed shooting, or that the dialogue taking place is between two mythological figures. I'd personally also like to know where Lars's horse is in all of this. Number 2. Catching the arrow in midair. This is a trick shot, and like all trick shots, it requires a very careful setup. Mythbusters tackled this twice and pronounced the myth busted. For Lars to grab an arrow from the air requires a lot of practice with his partner. As well, the bow can't be pulled back to full draw, otherwise the speed of the arrow would literally burn and rip the flesh from the catcher's hand. With practice, 2 people can do this trick, but it requires a lot of practice from the same angle, from the same bow, with the arrow moving at the same relatively slow speed. In archery, consistency is key. In the chaos of either long-range or short-range combat, this would be an ineffective technique, as the arrows would be moving too fast and from too many different distances and directions. Number 3. Archers nowadays stand still, firing at a target board, something that was unknown in the past. These archers also started placing the arrow on the left side of the bow. This is false. First, archers have always practiced archery on stationary targets. If we're lucky, we also sometimes get to practice on moving ones, but there are plenty of historical manuscripts which clearly show archers practicing on targets, and it's hard to believe Lars missed them. Second, the video refers to archers switching sides to use the left side of the bow nowadays, claiming that at some unspecified point in time, archers moved the arrow's resting position from the opposite side of the riser from the draw hand to the same side as the draw hand in the interests of speed. This is one of its unfortunate inaccuracies regarding not just historical archery, but modern archery. Modern archers don't shoot, strictly speaking, from the left or right. They shoot with whichever eye is dominant, which is occasionally different from their dominant hand. As people are not universally right-eye dominant, so too are archers not universally shooting on the left side of the bow. To illustrate his point, Lars engages in a comically bad and exaggerated knock-and-draw sequence to show how much trouble he has with the technique of knocking and shooting off the opposite side. I'm about to say something that I'm going to be repeating a few times here. Archery is about what works. Besides there being no indication and no record of a time period where archers universally decided to move to this method from another, there's no indication that the opposite side method slows people down terribly in the shot sequence. The reason why the arrow is most often resting on the opposite side of the riser from the draw hand in most archery disciplines is due to something called the archer's paradox. The archer's paradox is a complicated set of physics phenomena which occur when an arrow is released. Upon release, the arrow flexes around the riser and then back in a rapid oscillation before the fletching catches the air and stabilizes the arrow's flight by spinning it. Now, it can be debated as to whether this one step in the overall shot sequence renders the shooting faster or not, but there are several other trick shooters out there who can shoot moving targets really fast and who don't use this method. Now, this isn't to say that the techniques that Lars draws upon, which are still in practice today, mind you, by many Asian and Eastern European traditions, don't work. After all, archery is about what works. But remember, his claim is not just that his way is faster, but that he's rediscovered a lost technique. Number 4. Aiming at a stationary, two-dimensional target forces archers to aim with only one eye instead of two. I'm not going to spend much time on this one. This is patently absurd. Besides there being no reason for that to happen, and this being a very easy fact check, archers do not aim with only one eye while shooting because depth perception is incredibly important to archers. Number 5. The back quiver is a Hollywood myth. Wow. If Lars truly had pored over historical manuscripts, he would have seen many representations of many types of quivers from many time periods and from many cultures, and while there isn't much in the way of artist renderings of back quivers from England, there are many images of back quivers from many other cultures worldwide, including from the same cultures he shows still images of in his video. In contrast to details of technique, artists' renderings of equipment would not have had the same problems of historical accuracy, so we know that back quivers have existed for many, many centuries. In addition, graves often had these quivers, along with arrows, other weapons, and other worldly possessions buried alongside their users. Not all archers used or use quivers, but most do. And again, we're treated to QVC infomercial sad clown comedy relief moments like these, where Lars tries to illustrate how the quiver gets in the way, ruining his archery. It's reminiscent of a bad customer on a support call. Did you try turning it on, sir? If we wanted to get even more detailed, we could point out that many of the archers whose traditions Lars was borrowing from were horse archers who used these techniques on the open steppes, where getting one's quiver caught in tree branches would have been extremely rare, as trees are fairly sparse in open grassland. It's for this reason that many traditional Mongolian and Siberian bows are made from horn and sinew and not as much in the way of wood. Again, archery is about what works. It's a practice that's been around for at least 11,000 years, with variations on the same theme running across cultures and across time. If back quivers didn't work, they wouldn't have been used through many cultures across millennia. Number 6. The historical documents also told Lars that an archer should be able to use either hand when shooting, and an archer in motion must be able to hit a blade so that the arrow splits into two parts. As Lars never reveals which historical documents gave him his information, besides Arab archery, where he bases his premises on unspecific references and mythological figures, we can't address that claim. To use a scientific phrase, it's so non-factual that it's not even wrong. Now, there's nothing wrong with being ambidextrous in shooting. He just doesn't back this up. With regards to the splitting an arrow claim, however, that one's mostly false due to physics, but in this case there are also questions surrounding the video itself. Most arrows have traditionally been made from wood, and while it's a favorite trope of pop culture to talk about splitting an arrow in two, it's impossible due to the fact that wood grain does not run evenly down its length. Instead, both Mythbusters and Lars had to use bamboo to split an arrow. Snopes devotes a section of its comments to this, pointing out the required and synthetic prep work and potential camera tricks. I highly recommend going to see that link. Number 7. There are even myths of archers who could grab an enemy's arrow and shoot it back at him. Well, at least this one is honest about being a myth. Number 8. Perhaps most importantly, modern, slow archery has led people to believe that war archers only shot at long distances. This only makes sense if the only war archery a person has been exposed to has been medieval Western European and specifically British archery. In that particular archery tradition, English longbowmen, mostly drawn from the peasant class, were usually deployed along the flanks of the army. According to historians, the English longbow usually pulled at least 81 pounds draw weight, and it's argued that it was possibly over 130 pounds. These tactics were used to great effect in distance shooting, with the objective being to have the arrows rain down in a storm. The sort of close-up speed shooting that Lars demonstrates would not have been effective in the sorts of military tactics that the English used to such great effect in their campaigns. Agincourt would almost certainly have taken a very different turn, and the world would have been sadly deprived of the glorious St. Crispin's Day speech Shakespeare wrote. Here, I'd like to point out that Lars is using a lightweight bow, perhaps at a guess about 35 pounds. This is important to note because it gives him a relatively easy pull. For someone who continually talks about historical war archery, this wouldn't have done any damage to an armored fighter. He's also not even drawing it back fully in many of the speed shots we see, so the weight is going to be even less than 35 pounds for those. This will also help him with the catching the arrow in midair trick shot. The weight might be as little as 15 pounds depending on how far back the other bow is drawn. Most archers these days who hunt with traditional non-compound bows shoot with at least a 35 pound for some unarmored game, but more likely with at least a 40 pound and more likely a 50 to 60 pound for larger or faster game. But in addition to English longbow tactics, the world is known for a very long time about many different sorts of archery in battle. Just in mounted archery alone, there are the Mongols, the Scythians, the Sassanids, the Sarmatians, the Huns, the Comanches, the Parthians, the Cuman, the Mamelukes, Byzantine Kavalleroi, Turkish Timariots, Russian Druzhina, Japanese samurai, and many others. The Scythians and Huns, for example, engaged in what is called light horse archery. They were skirmishers, coming in fast and shooting while riding, then peeling away suddenly. Russian Druzhina, in contrast, utilized heavy horse archery. The Mongols used both light and heavy horse archery, depending on their needs in the battle. Though archery is universal amongst all cultures, there is and was no universal best method, because every culture has had different needs for archery in war, in battle, and in hunting at different times in their history, all according to their specific needs, specific culture, and specific environment. Number 9. In the beginning, archers probably drew arrows from their quivers or from their belts, but since then they started holding their arrows in their bow hand and later in their draw hand. There's no time or culture specified, but Lars's own video contradicts this assertion. If there had been a definitive and widespread evolution from quiver to draw hand, we should see the timeline track with his assertions, sort of like an archery fossil record, with the most recent evidence being that of the draw hand hold. Instead, he cherry-picks isolated images sprinkled throughout different cultures at various points in time, indicating, at best guess, a sporadic use of this method and no evidence of such an evolution. Number 10. Regarding holding arrows in the draw hand. When guns started replacing bows, this technique was forgotten. Again, at what point in time and culture is Lars under the impression that this was ever a dominant technique of holding arrows? To give Lars the benefit of the doubt here, perhaps it's just sloppy narration. But without a time period and culture or cultures specified, this assertion reads as this being a universally utilized way of shooting, and that it was subsequently put down simultaneously and globally, and unfortunately the available evidence contradicts this. Number 11. Modern archers only use one hand, but in the past, some archers allegedly used both hands to give the arrow more power. It's hard to know what he's trying to say with this one, and again, he never pinpoints a time and place, but at a guess, based on the video, I'd say he's comparing modern target shooting with the speed shooting is doing. He'd still be incorrect. Archers don't use one hand when going through the shot sequence. Archers use both sides of their bodies to draw an arrow, typically by loading the weight into the large muscles in the back and squeezing the shoulder blades together. Typically, the archer shoots with the bow arm, relaxing the draw hand's fingers and allowing the string to pass through the fingertips. In his shooting, Lars appears to exaggerate this by shoving the bow forward instead and not bringing the arrow to anchor. There are several archery techniques involving shooting without anchoring. Speed shooting is often one of them, and there are many speed shooters who employ this method for close-range archery, so Lars isn't exactly a pioneer even amongst other trick shooters. Number 12. From old texts, we know that Saracen archers were expected to be able to fire 3 arrows in 1.5 seconds. I'll forego asking about which old texts he's referring to this time and simply ask this. How did the Saracens measure seconds? In conclusion, I am not discrediting his skill at what he does. It's pure and harmless trick shooting of a style that he created, borrowing from styles still in existence today. The archery itself is entertaining more or less, as is most trick shooting, and there are some incredibly skilled trick shooters out there. The problem that many archers have with Lars Andersen's archery video lie in the unsupported assertions and sloppy historical broad brushing rather than his results. The claims of rediscovering forgotten historical techniques and revelations of hidden knowledge with regards to both ancient and modern archery in the video just aren't factual. It's something to keep in mind whenever you see a link with a clickbait title like "So-and-so proves that everything you know about such and such is a myth." The key word to remember in that phrase might be the last one. Stay skeptical, and thanks for watching.
I guess you could say I take comedy pretty seriously.